Welcome back to the Business Immigration Benchmark. With me again today is Global Managing Partner Audrey Lustgarten. Audrey, thanks for joining us. Can you tell us what are the new updates coming into Q4 of 2024?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me back, Laura. A few updates that I think are important for companies to keep in mind going into Q4. We're watching Canada really closely here. There's been a bit of movement with their immigration program becoming a little bit less welcoming than it has been in the past. So far, that's been restricted to mostly low wage stream employment. So not folks that are in the kind of professional classification, which are, most of the corporates that we work with. But there's definitely, some rumbling that may expand into other areas of Canadian immigration and a few other limitations around, work rights for students and things like that. So generally kind of trending in a negative direction there in Canada. Other things that are top of mind would be the EU, in the EU, the Schengen area, rolling out the entry-exit system. That's going to be happening in the beginning of November, where they're going to be now tracking folks entering the area electronically. So it's no more, looking through the passport to see how many days someone has been there. They'll have an electronic record of it. And of course, for the Schengen area, visa waiver nationals are limited to 90 days within any 180-day period. So super important for folks to be keeping track of how many days they are there, because if you go over that, it's going to be really noticeable now that it's tracked digitally, and you can actually be barred from returning to the area for 3 years or be fined. So there's some pretty significant consequences of miscalculating your days. And then last but not least, I'd highlight that the UK's electronic travel authorization system is going to be rolling out beginning of January. I think it's January 8th for all nationalities apart from Europe. And then later, I think it's the beginning of April, it'll become effective for European nationals. So that means that people traveling to the UK now will need to apply for that ETA in advance of travel, or they will be in for an unpleasant surprise when they arrive at the airport and cannot board their flight.
Okay, wow. So let's dig a little deeper into, I think, what are some alarming headlines out of Canada. I know being in the global mobility space, people are a little freaked out about this upcoming restrictions, even though for low-wage workers, like you said, folks are predicting potential restrictions on professional employees. And for U.S. companies that leverage Canada as an option B when their highly skilled workers don't receive H-1B lottery selections, Canada is the most available option based on processing times, office locations. So tell us, if there's a restriction in Canada, like what would that look like? What are, I guess, options C? Tell us what we're in for, because again, if we're facing a Trump administration in 2025, we might, here in the US companies might see further restrictions or difficulties potentially with H-1B workers.
Yeah, no, I mean, Canada is kind of the go-to option B for US companies. If you can't get someone here on an H, or they're running out of time, or you just need a more, easily accessible for foreign talent than what's available in the US, Canada's really been historically the go-to, being same or similar time zone, depending on where you're based. English speaking, it's just really attractive and accessible, I think, to a lot of U.S. companies running into limits with U.S. immigration. The headlines have been rather alarming. I think it's being driven by higher than usual unemployment rate in Canada. So there is some political pressure, which we don't usually see there, to restrict immigration and to protect Canadian jobs. And that's kind of what this change with no longer allowing labor market impact assessment-based work permits for low-wage stream workers was about. But we don't know that the government's necessarily going to stop with that. So we're watching it really closely. It is something where they could choose to limit LMIA-based work permits for folks in the high wage and the professional classification in the future. Those work permits are typically used for new hires. They do require, as the name indicates, a labor market test to show that there aren't Canadian workers to fill the role. So it would be particularly frustrating to not be able to access that, even if you can show there are no Canadian workers to take a role. But it is possible that it could spill over into that or into other categories of work permits that corporates often use. So we're keeping a close eye on that. Unfortunately, no further details yet as to, where exactly it may spill over and impact folks. In terms of, plan C, looking at other options outside of the US and Canada, Mexico is definitely another option. They've maintained really a pretty liberal immigration policy. It's fairly straightforward to get a work permit in Mexico. They have, it's not formally a digital nomad work permit. It was around long before the pandemic, so it doesn't bear that name, but there is kind of a work permit category, temporary residence visa for non-remunerated individuals that can be used like a digital nomad visa, where you can have someone in Mexico working for a company outside Mexico, so basically parked in Mexico, working for a US or Canadian company remotely. Those visas and permits are really pretty easy to get. The Mexican government kind of takes the position that if the company needs this individual, they're the best judge of, who's eligible to fill that role at their company, what they should do, what they should be paid, what their qualifications should be. So there's not a lot of, having to have a particular qualification or having to meet a prevailing wage. Obviously, the minimum wage from an employment perspective, but beyond that, not a lot of hoops to jump through. So Mexico's a good option. That's not always something that companies or foreign nationals are open to considering for a number of reasons. So after that, I would look, the Netherlands has some good programs, but for most of them, you're going to need to have an office there. And that's true for most other countries. So really, the next step when I'm planning with a client is, okay, the US and Canada, if they're not an option, where do you have offices? And then we can kind of narrow down the list from there into kind of green. These office locations provide for easy processing for work permits. Yellow, red is usually how we do it. It kind of maps things out so that they can see what the other options are out there. The only other thing to mention is digital nomad visas are still alive and well in many jurisdictions. That can be a super simple way to get people parked in another country. Bahamas, I think, is one of the fastest. I don't even know if it takes a week to get your visa there, and individuals can apply for it on their own. Obviously, the weather's lovely as we head into fall, winter, but there can be other considerations like employment and tax, and not all companies are going to go for the digital nomad option.
So yeah, thanks for keeping us up to date on this. And, we're not trying to be alarmist about it, but we are seeing some restriction trends. And again, like in light of a US upcoming election, it could be quite difficult for companies. I don't think there's anything to do quite yet, but do reach out to Audrey if you want to sort of explore some of these options or want to walk through deeper into what she's seeing. And we'll continue to have Audrey on to give us updates in this area, obviously concerning Canada, because it is a very used and leveraged option for almost a U.S. immigration strategy. So obviously we need to closely follow this trend here. So thanks for that. But tell us more about the EU's new entry-exit system. This again seems like this could impact a lot of U.S. companies that send their folks to, EU operations, probably on this visitor type of classification. So tell us more about what seems like kind of increased compliance.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely a minefield for companies that have employees with frequent travel to EU, and particularly the Schengen area, which is the common border area. U.S. citizens are visa waiver to go there. Citizens of many other countries are as well. So it can kind of be casual in terms of, maybe not having formalities around permission for travel or tracking of days. But really with this new entry-exit system, we're strongly recommending that companies get ahead of that and institute, tracking of days, or at least get communications out to employees that may be impacted to make sure that they're aware. Because a lot of people think, oh, I get 90 days every time I enter the area. And so if I'm running out of days, I'll just leave and come back. And that's not the case. It's within a rolling 180-day period, which can be a little bit tricky to calculate. We're happy to help people or point them to there are some, calculating apps and things like that that can help. But it's just, really important that your travelers to Europe realize that it's 90 days within a 180-day period. They need to be tracking their days. And there can be really serious consequences if they go over, fines, a 3-year bar. And it can be difficult. We've even had, instances where people were traveling frequently because there was a business need and then they needed to be assigned to work, say, for a year or two at the company, its European office. And if they've triggered a bar, it can be very difficult to overcome that and to get a work permit. So it may be that then they're not able to take an assignment where the company really needs them to be. So super important to keep an eye on this.
And do you recommend that the company who has frequent EU travelers take on the burden of calculating? Because it sounds like this is an individual compliance issue, right?
Yeah.
The bar or fines attached to the individual
Yeah.
traveler, not a company, because it's not a company sponsorship when these travelers are entering the EU. So what are you recommending from like a company policy? Because the individual's traveling perhaps to perform work for the company and perform those work activities. So what are you advising your clients, your companies to do to help with this compliance?
From a legal perspective, it is the individual's responsibility to track their days. And they are the ones, incurring the fines in a personal capacity or incurring the bar in a personal capacity. So that is really where the responsibility lays. But that said, obviously, if they're not able to travel for future business meetings or they're not able to take an assignment, that could have an impact on the company's operations. So, it really kind of depends how the company has things set up, kind of what compliance protocols they already have in place. If you are a large company and you already have things in place that you can turn on or leverage to assist the employees in tracking, that's great. If you're a more mid-size or a smaller company and you don't have access to those resources, then for those folks, we're mostly just, advocating for communication to make sure that, they are proactively making their employees aware of this. We included it in our newsletter. We're going to be sending, as we get closer, more alerts to clients. So some folks are sharing that with employees just to make sure, they're aware that this is coming online. This is going to be a change. It's not going to be business as usual when you turn up on November 11th. And that, it's 90 days within a 180-day period that they need to be tracking and monitoring.
Yeah, that can be really tricky for an individual who is used to the freedom of in and out, or maybe leveraging this gray area of how compliance maybe not be enforced, or, not necessarily paying attention very keenly to the 180-day sort of period that they're like, oh, it seems about right, kind of a vibes test. And then, yeah, with this new compliance system, there's just not going to be this gray area anymore. So
Yeah, and it's also different a little bit by country. I mean, some countries have already become very strict in
okay.
monitoring the time. We tend to see, Switzerland, Germany being strict, and a lot of people running into trouble. Some other countries, which shall maybe remain unnamed, not being as strict. So particularly travelers, that are going to a country that hasn't yet become strict about it, we worry that they're in for a surprise. So want to get the
Yeah, they
word
might be
out there.
surprised.
Yes.
So if this is something that, could impact your, frequent travelers, like check in with Audrey just to sort of come up with some best practices. And I know like some of your clients have, to book travel through the company. Often if that employee is being required to perform activities in the EU, they're also required to book travel through the company. And as Audrey said, maybe there's not a program set up for that, but maybe you want to at least have some sort of check-in notification so that the company can help be aware of who might be subject to these compliance rules, to just make sure you're not setting up any employee to have any fines or future travel restrictions. That might be a good place to start, is like Audrey said, some sort of communication protocol for small to mid-sized clients that might not have a sophisticated international travel booking program in their systems.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, and then let's wrap with tell us what's going on with the UK's e-visas and what we should expect through the end of this year and what's teed up for 2025?
Yeah, so the UK is really well, there's a couple things I actually didn't mention the e-visas before, but they are moving to an e-visa system that's replacing the biometric residence permit. So that's for folks that are living in the UK, and that is something that has caught some folks by surprise. But most individuals have been contacted by the UK Home Office via email to let them know like they can now apply for an e-visa. Everyone that's currently living in the UK should be getting those communications, but at this point are eligible to apply for the e-visa to replace their biometric residence permit. So that's for folks that are living there. And that is coming up. The kind of expiration date on everyone's BRPs is the end of this year. So December 31, 2024. We were very happy that they rolled out the portal to apply for the e-visa a little early. We had nightmares of, that rolling out over Christmas or
Sure.
something. And not being the most pleasant of holidays for anyone involved, but they do already have it out. So we encourage people to take a look at that. Again, we included it in our newsletter, but definitely also around the travel piece. It seems like although the UK is no longer part of the EU, they are in sync here with more electronic monitoring coming online and having that electronic travel authorization system roll out for everyone other than European nationals. January 8th is the date to watch if you have frequent travelers to the UK or anyone that is going to need to visit the UK come January. They're going to need to make sure they've applied for the ETA in advance or they won't be able to board their flight. And this is also going to trip up a few people. So if you have a criminal conviction lurking somewhere in the background, even if it's a rather old one, rather small one, it is likely that that person is not going to be granted an ETA and then would have to apply for a regular visa, kind of mirroring what goes on the US side. So just a heads up there. It's a little difficult. Don't always know if employees have these criminal convictions
Yeah.
in their past. But obviously, if you become aware that anyone does, that is something else to look out for that, the ETA may be denied.
Yeah, that can be really tricky because, depending on the age of the criminal conviction and folks have things, at least in the US, expunged, that can still come up in immigration proceedings. Just because it's expunged doesn't mean it goes away. It just means it's harder to get the documents practically from an immigration standpoint. And
Yeah.
so if you're running into this in the future with any of your employees, definitely loop in counsel because you, of course, want to make sure you're abiding by your employment policies and whatever employment law is governing what state you're in. And then also then handling the immigration issue, because if you need to get this employee into the UK and now cannot, there are steps to take there, as well as making sure you're not running afoul of any, state employment law. So that can be pretty tricky. Hopefully that doesn't come up for anyone, but inevitably it will. So don't hesitate to reach out. But it sounds like a lot of what I'm hearing in 2025, both in the UK and the EU, is increased travel restrictions and compliance in the UK and the
Yeah.
EU. And so if this is something that your company is sending in employees frequently, to definitely reach out to understand what protocols, policies your company may want to have in place, and just understanding what kind of compliance the individual has to put in place and be mindful of when traveling in 2025. Is that a pretty good summary, or anything else you want to add? Or
No, I think that's really good, Laura. Just kind of for better or worse, we're in the era of digital monitoring here.
yeah,
And so it is more important than ever to pay attention to, where your employees are going, what they're doing, just because they've gone there without a problem in the past. I hear that every day when someone's contacting me about a problem they have
right.
now encountered. Just because they have been able to go in the past doesn't mean they'll be able to go in the future. Definitely UK, EU areas, cracking down on this. But I think it is really a worldwide trend. On the one hand, can get more things done digitally, but on the other hand, that means that governments know more about what people are up to and where exactly they are.
Yeah, less gray areas. I think, immigration generally, at least, from a US practitioner standpoint, is always a dynamic space, especially in light of elections. We see politics kind of challenging headlines. People get scared, increased compliance. So that's always sort of been the state of the US immigration. And now we're obviously seeing that more and more on the global space. How do we want to summarize the dynamic space in the global immigration mobility world, Audrey? similarly dynamic?
I
Or,
think so.
when would you be advising like clients to sort of be checking in or to keep a pulse on what's upcoming and changing in the space?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always good to do, that check in at the beginning of the year or even the end of the year as you're kind of thinking about the coming year and what your needs are going to be, because that will drive what you need to be concerned about. If all of a sudden
Right.
you've got a whole bunch of people needing to travel to Europe, well, then you know what's going to need to be top of mind. If they're headed to Australia, it might be, different. So I think checking in at a programmatic level at the end or the beginning of the year is really good. But I think it's got to be in terms of changes that are happening, it's got to be more frequent than that, keeping up with things. We put out the monthly newsletter where we're trying to capture the, kind of most pressing updates in the space. So I think, watching for that is good just to keep updated as we go throughout the year on changes that governments roll out.
Yeah, I like that. I think you're right. Like capturing, an alert or sort of a prospectus at year end or beginning of year of countries where you're focused on where you have operations to get an understanding and context of what's going on there and what to expect within, setting alerts or setting heightened review in month to month in those areas to make sure you're not missing anything. Seems like a lot. And that's why, if you're partnering with a firm like WR Immigration that's got a beat on the global space, that we can sort of serve up what's coming down the pipe to just make sure you have an awareness to communicate to your employees. Subscribe to Audrey's newsletter, and we'll continue to have Audrey on the podcast here to tell us what we need to know and what to be thinking about in the months ahead. Audrey, any final concluding thoughts here to leave our listeners with?
No, I think you wrapped it up really nicely, Laura. Just stay tuned, stay alert, because there are just changes constantly rolling out. I think the only constant is change in the global space.
Adopting that mindset is key to be a global mobility leader and working in this space. Audrey, thanks so much. We'll surely have you on in 2025 to keep us updated with what's going on in the new year. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me, Laura.